project that began in 2016 when Penn State had a large number of retirements, at which point it became very apparent that we were going to lose a lot of institutional history. So I started a project that wound up with 150 interviews. And I will not be directly identifying people when I talk about specific recommendations. What I will do is start with this quote and then just talk about anecdotes. So this quote is from Jim Neal, who was a former associate dean at Penn State and former ALA president. And during his interview, he said, he made this statement, which I think is really important in terms of libraries and archives. And he said, librarians will know they've arrived when the president of the university or the mayor of the city or the principal of the school assembles a group in a room and says, we cannot proceed with this conversation. The librarian is not here. And I know that's wishful thinking, but to me, that was really empowering. And it talked a lot about what I thought was important about this series of interviews. And that was the legacy of the libraries, what the libraries had accomplished in the years, the 60 years that turned out to be the scope of the interviews. So Library Legacies was an oral history project for approximately 2 years. And what it aimed to do was to capture and make accessible interviews, not only by former library administrators, faculty, and staff, but by present university libraries administrators, faculty, and staff as well. And the reason for including present employees was it's fine to look back at the past at what we had done. It's as important to look at what we are doing and then put the two together and help it to form what our future should look like. And so that was the point, one of the points for the project. The interviews wanted to place the work of the libraries in their context at the university, mostly so that we could amplify the role of librarians, so we could talk about how librarians interact with university administration, how they interact with their communities, and what their individual goals were throughout their careers, both for people who chose to become librarians right out of college or people who, as one interviewee said, librarianship was the second best career he had ever attempted to have. I used oral history as a tool to capture the stories. For me, it captures the voices of the individuals. It allows them to talk about what they're experiencing and how they experience the various parts of their careers, both at Penn State and at any other institution they were at prior to Penn State, or for the retirees, what they had been doing since their retirement. In Jim Neal's case, being a perfectly good one, he left Penn State, went to Johns Hopkins, then went to Columbia University, and only when he retired from Columbia University did he run for president of the American Library Association. So the scope of careers and the scope of activities within librarianship was really important. And the best way to capture a lot of that was through oral history. The oral histories in general, as an archival practice, allow us to understand how individuals see their experience. And it permits us to look at collective history. And in this case, the collective history was 60 years of Penn State librarianship. The earliest interview, the person started in 1958, and the most recent interview, the person who I interviewed started in 2018. So the process of oral history is a lot more complicated than most people understand. So there's a lot of research and preparation prior to doing the interviews, both in terms of institutional history as well as biographies for individuals. Once you do that, then you can conduct the interviews. You can then have the interviews transcribed, edit the interviews, and then put them into an archive or special collection. Part of the process of oral history, not only in doing the interviews and doing the background history, is still in the transcript. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in terms of lessons learned. But it's important to understand that you just don't decide one day, I'm going to interview this person, without doing the background work on them and understanding where they've been and what they've done, just so that you can have this conversation as they're talking about the history of their time here. One of the former administrators that I interviewed at one point specifically asked me if this is what happened in that year at Penn State. And my former role as university archivist, came in very handy in terms of understanding when a particular president was at Penn State or when a particular dean was at Penn State. At what point did we change from general reference to subject libraries? At what point did the history of the university libraries change, as well as the focus of the university in general? So there were 6 principles that I worked with, using the basic principles outlined by the Oral History Association. And they had a lot to do with understanding the culture and climate of the university and the library, listening to the interviewees, where they were coming from, understanding what was important to them, organizing the themes of the interviews, respecting people's privacy, which is why Jim Neal is the only person I will identify by name, building a cohort of information, and then communicating back and forth with the interviewees about the process as the process goes on. So let me give you some background history in terms of Penn State libraries. The libraries have been in existence for 160 years. The first collection opened in February of 1859, when the first students came to Penn State. There were approximately 1,500 volumes. The library was in a small room in the main administration building, and it was used in the building only. The first standalone library building opened in 1904. It was funded by Andrew Carnegie, who funded many, many libraries. It had a capacity of 50,000 volumes. And as is true through much of Penn State Libraries history, the library collection moved into the building, and the building was full on day one. So from the time that we moved into the Carnegie Library, the library administration was looking at ways to get a bigger building and additional spaces to house the collection. Between 1937 and 1940, the Petit Library was built. It was funded by the Works Progress Administration under President Roosevelt's initiative. It would house a collection of over 200,000 volumes, and it would be in the center of the library. It is literally placed at the top of the hill, at the intersection of the main road in campus, to eliminate vehicle traffic on campus. And it is still on the hill in the center of main campus. Post-World War II, Petit Library expanded with the addition of a stacks area and a west wing to house over 800,000 titles. And in the past year, last 18 months, that west wing was revitalized and rebuilt and turned into a collaboration commons. By the fall of 2000, the Paternal Library joined Petit Library. It had digital technologies areas. We moved to subject libraries, and the library had over 4 million volumes. Between 2014 and 2019, Penn State's main library grew to include knowledge commons and collaboration commons, group study spaces, green technologies. There's an average attendance in the main building of between 8,000 and 10,000 visitors a day. And opening just on Monday for the beginning of the fall semester, the library as an organization has over 8 million volumes, over 800 databases, 200,000 plus ebooks, et cetera, et cetera. And it's the number 7 ARL ranked library. It is not just the main building, though. The Penn State Libraries has 4 individual subject libraries around the main University Park campus. It has 5 annex buildings in State College, and then every campus has a library. So it is the Penn State University libraries geographically dispersed. With that background, let me talk a little bit about the project numbers and demographics. I mentioned that the earliest start date for an interviewee was 1958. That interviewee worked in cataloging and did traditional cataloging. In 1958, the library on the Hill was closed stacks. You had to go up to a reference desk, request what you wanted, and then that material would be delivered to you, and it was used in the building. Students were not allowed to roam around the building. The most recent start date for an interviewee was this October of 2018, and that person was hired to work on digital technologies and with digital collections. The interviewers, there are 151 interviewers, 55 males and actually 96 females, and that breaks down to about 63%, 36%. In terms of how that fits with the university libraries, the libraries employs approximately 150 full-time faculty and 300 full-time staff throughout its entire system. Interviews were conducted throughout the entire system. There were only 2 campuses that were not part of the interview process. So interviews were geographically dispersed as well. By the way, as I do this, if you have questions, you can post them in chat and I'll try to answer them for you. So in terms of breaking down the project scope, administrators were current administrators, former administrators were either retirees or people who are no longer working at Penn State. Administrators would include deans and department heads. Faculty included all level of faculty. Penn State is a tenured faculty system, so it's all levels of faculty, assistant, associate, full, and former faculty, again, were either retirees or faculty who had left and gone somewhere else, similar with staff. And staff were all levels of staff with the exception of tech services, which at Penn State tends to be physical plant, and in the case of the libraries, media services. And you can see the breakdown was approximately 41% faculty, 34% staff, and 25% staff. What's important about the project scope and how it impacts the recommendations that come out of the project has to do with the voices that get heard and where they place themselves in what is a traditional higher education administrative hierarchy, where there are deans and department heads and faculty and staff and both part-time staff and full-time staff and students, all different levels, and voices and concerns come out from every one of those levels. The tools for the project were more 2018-19. I used a digital recorder. It recorded on Wave, and then those recordings were translated to MP3s. The MP3s were then uploaded to a box storage site. They were submitted to Trint. Now, Trint is a company that's run out of Ireland. They have translator services. It is done through robotics. So you submit your MP3, and within a half hour, you get a draft transcript. Now, I say you get a draft transcript because it does not have the names of the interviewer or the interviewee, and it needs to be heavily edited. One of the nice things about working with Trint is it was a fairly young software company. And in the course of the 2 years that I worked on the project, I was allowed to build a project thesaurus. So, for example, I could explain to Trent that ALA meant American Library Association. We have a local public library here called SCLO, and not once in 150 interviews did it spell that right. So I was able to build a thesaurus with the company to use for other interviews, and that became really helpful. The transcript does come with a time code, and the transcript can be downloaded as a PDF. It can be downloaded as a document. It can be downloaded as HTTP. Many different formats. I did have to work on transcript edits, and that actually still, despite having a translator, is still the longest part of the process with oral histories. Transcripts still take a long time, about half as much time as they would if you didn't have a draft transcript to work with, but they still take a long time. So there were 6 major project trends, 6 things about library history that came through in just about every single interview. They included the impact of technology. In 1958, there were no computers. And so in the early interviews, the interviews with early employees, you talk about discussing about computers and getting computers and when they came and how we shared them. Perhaps the most important trend throughout the entire 60 years of the scope of the project was the importance of public services. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time with that in a minute. Because I interviewed administrators, faculty, and staff, the effects of stratified and hierarchical operational structures was discussed multiple times. We also discussed the role of promotion and tenure. Promotion and tenure came to Penn State faculty in the late 1970s, early 1980s. It was a hard-fought battle by the dean who fought for it, and discussing what people understood about promotion and tenure, what faculty knew coming into the job, what help they got, became a big part of people's stories. We spent a fair amount of time talking about the role of library professional organizations and how they can reach out and mentor and network better, and were they providing good role models. And then we also, the 6th topic that came up was the need for consistent and just-in-time professional development, especially as it related to technology. And that becomes a very big issue. I'm going to break each one of these down in a minute and talk about them. But what was interesting to me is how consistent these 6 topics were over the course of the interview. So we'll talk about technology to begin with. As I said, in 1958, there was no technology. When computers first started coming into the library, they were shared computers. People had assigned hours. There might be 1 computer for 6 people, and you came in and you worked on your 2-hour slot at the computer. And the services that were provided were, the computers that were used for specific products and forms, and they were not necessarily focused on services. As the computers became more focused on services, the activities tended to replicate what we used to do. Just last week, I had a discussion with one of the faculty members about how the forms still look the same as they looked 30 years ago, but now they're on computers. That's not unusual in terms of how we use computers. But I think the bigger story in terms of technology and how libraries over the last 60 years have adopted technologies were the discussions by multiple people about, are we driving or are we being driven? And if we're driving, why aren't libraries as a cohort deciding more of the agenda and asking for more of the services that they need from specific vendors? And from my perspective, it's a very valid question. If we're buying software and letting the software drive what we decide to do in the libraries, oftentimes there were stories by many people of software that didn't work, or we put a lot of energy and a lot of time into them, and then we moved on. And so the questions about, do we build services at Penn State? We originally built a library catalog, which then had to be migrated into a vended catalog. What did that mean? How many man hours, women hours did that require? What did that structure mean in terms of how we did other things like public services and annex services and warehousing? Can off-the-shelf software be used effectively? Do we have to jump on the next hottest thing every time it comes out? And then who decides that? Is there a committee that decides it? Is it an individual? One of the things that has changed over time at Penn State is who makes library computing decisions, who makes university computing decisions, and who has a voice in those decisions. And that those issues were fairly loudly discussed among all the interviews. We also discussed shared services and deliverables, as well as impact. Who is the technology impacting? How is the technology being used? Is it doing the job we need it to do when we need to use it? Interestingly, those questions do not change over the decades. The vendors change, the types of services that the libraries want to deliver may change, but how they deliver them change, but who's driving is the big question, and who should be driving. Public services. In 1958, we had closed stacks. You as a student would come to the library, request your materials, somebody would go get it for you, and you would sit in the library and use it. If you checked it out, you checked it out for a very short period of time because students, of course, could not be trusted. And what I found particularly interesting is in 2019, we have on the CAT an I want it button, which essentially is I tell the computer that I want a book, somebody goes and gets it for me, and I pick it up from a circulation desk. So in 60 years, some things haven't changed all that much other than who's driving the I want it button. The opening of the stacks was a big deal. In the 1970s, when the stacks were finally open and students could go browse their own books, it changed the interaction between the librarians and the staff. It changed the reactions between the librarians and the students. And students would be able to look at books along a shelf. Faculty would be able to look at books along a shelf. And interestingly, one of the upgrades to the current system that's being looked at is, can we electronically look at shelves and see what books are sitting next to one another, because that experience is still hardwired in a lot of users. What types of materials does the library serve? I talked to numerous librarians who talked about adding audiovisual materials, adding digital materials, how we organized journals, how subject libraries came into the central library from their various departments. Early on, Penn State had departmental libraries that were literally in the college departments. Education was in the college department. Agriculture and life sciences was in a college department, and decisions were made along the way that they would be integrated into the main library. And what did that mean in terms of services, and who did we serve, and who came with the books in terms of staff, and what kind of training did you get when you changed where you were working? And what did that mean in terms of having subject libraries and subject expertise? Where do public services get offered? Do they get offered at the point in space where students exist? Do they get offered in the dorm rooms, in the student union building, or do the students come to the library? And what does that service point mean? Who is the person at the service point? Does the person at the service point have to be a subject librarian? Should it be somebody who has some paraprofessional training? Can it be a student? And then what hours are we open? And the hours changed immensely between 1958 and 2019. The concept of 24/5, where the library would be open for 24 hours a day would have been unheard of in 1958. And those kinds of changes are interesting in terms of the impact of what was important. What didn't change in public service was the desire of the employees working in the library to be successful in delivering what a student or a faculty member needed when they needed it. That devotion, that dedication, that understanding that what librarians were serving their institution to do was to make sure that people got what they needed when they needed. That did not change one iota in the 60 years of interviews that I undertook. That service evaluation, why am I doing this? Why is this important? Why do these materials have to be available? Whether it's discussed as information literacy or it's discussed as opening the materials to the stacks to the public and having people be able to have access to it, whether it's discussed as social justice issues or just information access, that role of making sure that no one person had access to all the knowledge and that knowledge was not just available to those people who could afford it or could have access to it by privilege has always been part of the librarian's mantra and the library staff mantra. That in none of the interviews I did anybody wander away from saying, this is what I like about working in the library. This is what I want to do in the library. I want to make sure that these students succeed, that the faculty get what they need and want, and that we're providing services that can be used by the community. This is really important. The stratified operational structure is less positive in experience. The impact of hierarchical behaviors creates climate issues. And those climate issues can stifle creativity. They can stifle people's innovation and invention. Oftentimes we tend to blame it on communication. If we could just communicate better, if we could find a better way to communicate, it often becomes an issue in terms of inclusivity. Is the librarian the expert? Is the staff person the expert? Can I do this? May I do this? Who decides who does specific jobs and tasks at a library? Were discussed at great length. And I have to say, the saddest moment I had during the interviews was I was talking to an employee who had been with Penn State for over 30 years, and they felt that they were not allowed to answer the question, where do you see the library in 5 years? Because predicting the future and deciding what we do tomorrow was not part of their job description. I had a really hard time wrapping my mind around somebody who could have worked in the institution for that many years and still not feel empowered to make suggestions about what tomorrow should look like. The libraries is working on that. The university libraries is trying really hard to do a better job of onboarding, to do a better job of inclusion and diversity. But clearly it's something that we have to be really understand is still out there and we have to be really sensitive to. Similarly, with promotion and tenure, there was a lot of discussion about what faculty members knew, when they knew it, who told them, where did they get information from, was it something that they should be doing, did promotion and tenure have value? And the answer to most of those questions was yes, it's important that Penn State librarians be treated and understood to be faculty, and that their interactions with university faculty require that they have tenure and that they work on promotion, they produce research, and that they have all of those levels. There are challenges involved in that, and the challenges are understood. You know, librarians don't have 9-month contracts. Librarians don't have research assistants necessarily. Librarians have to do their day-to-day jobs as well as do promotion and tenure. Having mentors has helped immensely. There was more than once when the topic of who teaches mentors and how mentors are assigned came up, and maybe better ways for that to be administered. And that is something that the library faculty organization at Penn State is looking at in terms of faculty affairs, who evaluates mentors and how we evaluate the promotion and tenure system. It was really interesting in talking with librarians who are either on the track or have been through the track about their experience. If you tend to get through the track and you've made it, you understand the value to having it. As you're struggling through it, it seems to be a mountain that terrorizes people. And I think that's something we could do a better job of lowering the level of stress in faculty who are on the track so that they understand that this is something that is doable. This is something that is to their advantage and that they do have the strength to make it through to the end in terms of getting promoted, getting tenured, and then going up for full if that's the choice to be made. It's an interesting discussion. The interviewees who have been in multiple types of systems, both promotion and tenure and non-promotion and tenure, tended to feel that the promotion and tenure systems were worth the effort. And I thought that was fascinating, that it was worth the effort to go through, and that if your system doesn't have it, then you need to look at the contracts and what could better serve the faculty in terms of their activities in higher education. And again, this is limited to higher education, but it's an interesting part of the discussion. Perhaps the most time in terms of how could we do this better was spent on discussion of professional organizations. It is probably a surprise to no one that the professional organizations have in the last 3 to 5 years been under a lot of discussion about how can they do things better. Are they serving their organization? ALA is discussing their meetings twice a year. Do they need to have that? SAA is discussing how to make their membership more diverse and inclusive. Nagara and ARMA are looking at ways of going outside of state operations. ARMA particularly is looking at ways to be affordable. So professional organizations understand they have a problem. What I don't think they understand is how often they're losing people. Networking is critical. People join professional organizations so they can network. They appreciate the professional development delivery, but they have expectations on the learning that they do and how it impacts their day-to-day job that I'm not entirely sure professional organizations are meeting. There needs to be more transparency and more responsiveness. There needs to be more online service delivery. And for many library faculty and staff, there is a discussion about what organizations provide the best service. There are many library faculty in particular who are moving away from library associations to their subjects associations and are doing that because they get more out of their subject associations than they get out of library associations. It's an interesting conundrum, and I think it's something that we will see as a career, as an organization, change over the next 3 to 5 years. But I hope the professional organizations are listening to their membership about what they need and how to deliver it, because in this area, this is where most of the interviewees were the most negative about deliverables and am I getting value for the dollar I have to spend as a member. And I thought that was particularly unfortunate that professional organizations have a role to play and can be a voice for librarians and archivists, and they're not meeting their members' needs in a way that is as effective as they need to be in the 21st century. Lastly, day-to-day training and professional development. Because of technology, training has to be persistent. You can't just say it's one and done. And that includes whether it's training specifically for technology or it's training for new jobs or it's training for new service delivery. We can't be training people in January for something that's not going to happen until November. We can't be training people for a piece of software that then changes 9 times from beta to when it's actually rolled out. There needs to be just-in-time training. There needs to be training that is specific to the job that I'm being asked to do. And that includes both in-house experts and external experts. And whether we do that through webinars like the one we're doing today, or we do it through conference calls or have experts come in, there needs to be a major influx of focus and dollars on training and professional development. It is never a wasted asset to have people train. You can talk about the teachable moments and you talk about spontaneous training situations, but unless you're looking for them and you're looking at how they're delivered on a regular basis, the training tends to not keep up with the amount of changes in the institution. Interestingly, over the 60 years of interviews, that conflict between how much I'm being asked to change and what backup training I'm getting continues to be a problem. And that's unfortunate because the impact of having training available when it needs to be available is critical. And it helps make people feel comfortable in their jobs. So if you are going to make a lot of changes and a lot of institutional changes, having the training to back up those changes is critically important. So what were the most important lessons that are learned from this project? There's 151 voices that are being heard. I can verify that of those 151 voices, almost to a person, service was the most important aspect of their motivation. They come to work every day, they do their jobs because they want to be of service, whether they want to be of service to students or to faculty. They want to be that point of attention where they're doing something that is worthwhile, that is helping move the institution forward, is helping the students do better. And that is a really important guiding principle. And it's often an operational goal. And for many people, it's job number one. There is nothing more important. My favorite interview was with a staff person who works on delivery and annex systems and moving things around between campuses and doesn't necessarily ever see the person who's going to use the item that they're moving. And yet that person felt that their goal of getting a request into the hands of the requester in the shortest amount of time was the most important piece of success, because that meant that that person could do what they needed to do, whether it was research or studying or instruction, and that would make the institution more successful. And I thought it was the best understanding of beginning, middle, and end of a process, and how every person along that process is an important cog to make sure it happens and to make sure that that goal is reached. There were other lessons. I have been in archives for over 30 years. I know transcriptions take a long time, and transcriptions still take a long time. And I still have not finished all of the transcriptions for all of the interviews. And for that, anybody I interviewed, I will apologize. And for that, to anyone who's doing oral history, it is always, in my mind, going to be the conundrum of oral histories is getting the transcripts done. That even with audio recognition and scripting, it takes longer to edit than anticipate. One of my favorite stories about editing was the faculty member whose transcript I sent, and he tried to rewrite the whole thing because he didn't like what he said. And I had to explain that that's not what happens. That's not how this works. But in all of the years I've been in archives and libraries, oral history has functioned that way, and it doesn't change. And hopefully it'll get faster and better when we can do more audio recognition. But it's just surprised me that it still takes as long as it does, and I should have known better. I'm really concerned about professional organizations and their need to listen to their members, as well as understanding the services required and responding accordingly. And that needs to be a today activity. It can't be put off till tomorrow. Similarly, administrators need to actively integrate all levels of employees in decision-making. When employees feel that their voice is not being heard, their motivation changes significantly. And having multiple different types of voices at the table brings lots of experiences and looks at issues in different ways. And so in long-term planning, it is critically important to have multiple different voices at the table, everybody from students to staff to faculty, administrators to users. It opens the window to what can be done, what should be done, and makes people feel valued. And that's really important. The other part of that is reflective communication. One of the things that's not happening is everybody's talking about communication, and over 60 years, this was a theme that, you know, we would communicate, we would talk, and we would have meetings, and we have committees, and we have task forces, and we have, and yet changes don't get made. What's critical in that part is, yes, there's a lot of talking, but there's not a lot of reflecting going on. And reflecting is important. Reflecting is vital and necessary if we're going to be successful with new spaces, with new services, with new activities, and with new individuals, bringing new people into the profession. I get asked on a fairly regular basis by people who are thinking about becoming a librarian, you know, why should I do this? You know, what is the benefit of my doing this? This is what I think I'm going to do. And clearly, librarians don't all sit at desks and read books all day. Almost none of us do. So why do I need to do this, and what am I doing? And how we verbalize what's important about the career is really is vital and necessary. So what's next? I'm writing a report that will address the challenges, opportunities, and concerns. It'll be a white paper, and it will talk about the interviews and about the voices. We can begin to identify areas of improvement within strategic planning goals, things like expanding onboarding, expanding mentoring, broadening the basis of communication, broadening learning and teaching and training. We need to look at policies, procedures, and guidelines for inclusivity, diversity, and an equitable workplace, especially, you know, in Pennsylvania, but throughout the United States. Pennsylvania is not unique that way. When decisions are made and when reports are available, they need to be distributed as widely as possible, especially within professional organizations. Having ALA know what they're going to do and not telling anybody is not helpful. So we need to do that. And we also need to communicate across all employment bands. Talking to administrators and faculty and staff who have run the Penn State Libraries over the last 60 years, they have faced monumental challenges. The building has been rebuilt 5 times in those 60 years. The services have been changed as many times. The staffing has been changed. And in order to focus on those changes and the changes that are coming down the pike for the future, we need to value one another, and we need to be aware that everybody participates and everybody brings the library to the success it has right now. And if we want to continue to be successful, we have to look at ways to improve that. So I'd like to thank you for your patience and for listening to this. And if you have questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them.
Hey, Jackie. So I just see that there's a little bit of an echo, but I just wanted to point out that there are some questions in the chat, and I'll let you take them over.
Okay. So to answer Bernadette, how long does it take to transcribe 1 hour of interview? We used to say, the standard used to be 4 hours to transcribe 1 hour of interview. With the audio scripting, it takes about 2.5 hours for 1 hour of interview. For organizations, was cost a major factor? Yes. Many people have opted out of ALA and are becoming members of PALA or becoming members of other organizations because of cost, especially if the costs aren't being mitigated by their institution. Penn Staters are lucky in that they get funding for some of their travel, but costs and rising costs and hotel costs and meal costs and all of that is a big driver. But as important as that is, responsiveness is just as important. Feeling like your organization is listening and hearing you is as important as understanding what it's going to cost me to do this. Why don't libraries demand more from publishers and vendors? I wish I had a good answer to that. I think especially consortia should. I was actually a little disappointed that when the California system decided to stand up to Elsevier, that other organizations didn't stand behind them. I think we should be doing more in that. That's my own personal opinion. It is not, you know, it's based on my experience with publishers and vendors, and I do think that that needs to happen. Interestingly, back in the earlier days, the 1950s and 60s, publishers came to libraries with their hats in hands because they needed libraries to sustain them. I think the model has changed and gone in a direction it should not have gone in. Were there any trends for the fixed term faculty? That's a really interesting question because it's a category at Penn State that's not replicable in other places. The biggest trend for fixed term faculty, for staff, for faculty on the tenure track was to have people who have already been through the process, who are in positions of authority to understand what their needs are and what they need to succeed. And I think that that is something that fixed term faculty need to make understood. They need to talk about, they need to let their supervisors and administrators know they have concerns, and let the faculty organization understand that there is some inequity that shouldn't be there. Let's see. One of the questions that I asked people during this is why they chose to become a librarian, if they chose to become a librarian. And interestingly, about half of everybody I interviewed did not initially choose to be a librarian. They kind of wound up in library studies, but they wouldn't change their mind. They wouldn't look for another career. And I think that's interesting. I think that one of the facets for that is the difference between people who choose to go to library school and then go straight into working in libraries, and people who have done other things and then go to libraries to work, and what their understanding of acceptable job responsibilities are and things like that. And that's one of those communication levels that comes out really clearly when you look at the hierarchy. And the answer to the question, has anyone interviewed Jackie as part of the project? The answer to that is no. No one has interviewed Jackie as part of the project. And as of right now, that's not scheduled. I want to thank you all for your patience. I really appreciate it. I want to thank you for letting me share this. I do have much more information, and if you'd like any of it, you can just email me. My direct email is jxe2@psu.edu. Thank you. And I want to thank Aaron for allowing me to do this and scheduling this and organizing it and answering a ton of questions about it. So thank you to Aaron and to everybody. Have a good afternoon, and I hope for those of us where it's raining that it stops.
Okay. I'm going to mute Jackie just so we don't have too much of an echo, but I wanted to thank everybody for being here today. As a reminder, this was a Connect and Communicate session from the College and Research Division of the Pennsylvania Library Association. So thank you for all of you who showed up today. I really, really appreciate it. And thank you to Sarah Pike for doing our closed captioning. And thank you everybody for sticking around through some of our sound issues. If you can, please fill out the evaluation form that is in the chat box, and we'll see you all later. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Erin.